Welcome everyone. I'm Jen Mackey, a retired Olympic rower, and it's my pleasure to facilitate this webinar focusing on the energy needs of athletes and what happens when we don't eat enough. We've got performance dietitian Dane Baker and sports physician Dr. Sarah Beeble here to talk through this topic, so let's kick in. Dane, why is fueling so important?
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so for most people, we often think about reasons that we eat, and I guess a lot of sort of sports nutrition, we often think about reasons we eat might be to fuel the muscle with carbohydrate, and also thinking about recovering the muscle or repairing it with protein. But there's also a lot of other reasons why we need to eat, and this is sort of the energy that our sort of body runs off. It's sort of what we call sort of metabolic needs are all to keep everything alive. So our body needs energy for these key systems. So reproduction, reproductive hormones. Our body needs energy for bone. So bone's a living tissue that's constantly rebuilding itself. The immune system, to keep ourselves warm, to optimize all our cells in our body, and also cognitive function. So our brain is always using a lot of energy. So how we figure that out is basically this concept around how much energy do we have available for those processes? And that's kind of where this term energy availability comes from. And how we figure that out is basically if we think of all the calories from food and drink that we eat each day, then we minus the cost of our exercise, so our training sessions, then our body needs a certain amount of those calories left over for these key systems. So things like bone health, protein synthesis, reproduction, immune system, hormonal profile, and growth. So what our body is really good at is if we don't have enough energy left over, it basically pushes energy away from those systems. And eventually those systems might not be working as optimally as we would like. And so low energy availability, kind of, I guess the early research showed that there was a high prevalence in artistic sports or weight restricted sports like lightweight rowing, sort of weight restricted martial arts, ballet, performance sort of arts. And what we're seeing more recently is probably just an increase in the prevalence across all athletes. And that's probably coming from the increased training requirements, the volume, and also potentially an increase in sort of restricted eating patterns that we're seeing in athletes, and probably the body image pressures that come with that. So a way to think about that is potentially thinking like our body as our phone. So when our phone is running out of battery, it goes into power saving mode. And basically it's trying to conserve as much sort of power as possible. And that's pretty much what's going on in our body with low energy availability. It's kind of pushing energy away from those systems that we've talked about, and things aren't working optimally.
So Sarah, Dane's just talked about the importance of fuel and energy, but what happens when we don't eat enough and our batteries get close to empty? What does that mean as an athlete?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I mean, Dane's explained it really well of the difficulty when we're not getting enough fuel. And I like to think of the battery losing its power, or the car engine losing its spark plugs, and nothing is driving the engine. And we know that this affects a range of systems, but used to be called the female athlete triad. And this was basically when you see at the one end of the spectrum an anorexic or eating disordered athlete with brittle bones or osteoporosis who had a loss of period. And they were the kind of athlete that we'd see with recurrent stress fractures, with the inability to have a baby when they chose, and osteoporosis down the track, with a whole range of psychological consequences. What we now know is this is a real spectrum, and it got renamed as relative energy deficiency in sport. And we now know this encompasses a whole range of body system disruption. And so this can be low iron, it can be poor growth and development. There's a high risk of anxiety and depression. The cardiovascular system can be affected. There can be an effect on bowel and bloating, diarrhea, constipation, recurrent infections. But what I see most commonly, which usually prompts a visit to the doctor, is loss of period. Sometimes this starts as the period's becoming more spaced out, and then there can be a loss of period, which is also called secondary amenorrhea. Sometimes we see people who are age 19 or 20 who have never had a period, which is known as primary amenorrhea. Bone health is something that is affected, and often see recurrent stress fractures in people that aren't fueling enough or their battery is flat. And then we start to see dysregulation of the metabolic system. So people's weight gets poorly managed, and sometimes people can actually gain weight, and sometimes people can lose weight. So all these body systems can be affected. When we talk about the effect that this has on performance, often an athlete starts performing poorly, so they may not be hitting their training targets that they're spending so many hours trying to achieve. And we see concentration being affected, mood, irritability, decreased recovery, decreased strength, increased injury risk, decreased training response, impaired judgment, and just really noticing a drop-off in performance and fatigue. Sometimes this is related to the poor sleeping patterns that also occur with relative energy deficiency, but usually this flat battery or lack of an engine powering anything just starts to continue to go flat.
Thanks, Sarah. Such a clear message there that skinnier isn't necessarily better. Dane, Sarah's talked a lot about the prevalence of low energy availability and that it's very common, but how should we be fueling, and what does having appropriate energy availability look like?
Yeah, cool. So what I thought I'd do is try to just talk through what energy availability looks like. So first of all, to understand energy availability, it is a little bit different than sort of energy balance. So I'm trying to make it nice and simple here. So this might be an example of low energy availability. Let's just say, for an example's sake, we've got an athlete eating 1,800 calories. They might do a 2-hour football session and expend 800 calories. So what that means is there's about 1,000 calories left to this athlete. And we know from sort of years of research that that's what we classify as low energy. So what we're trying to do now with that same athlete is increase their intake to 3,000 calories. And now they've got pretty much 2,200 left to all those systems to work properly. So basically, we always need a baseline amount of energy left over for all those systems to work properly. So let's just show that as a bit of an example across different training days. So you can see here a rest day, feet on the couch. Our body still needs energy to work properly. So body still needs that baseline sort of close to 2,200 calories. Now we might go for an afternoon run and we might burn close to 500 calories. And then, which we often see now in our younger athletes or our elite athletes, is this multiple trainings across the day. And the more we train, the greater the risk, I guess, of low energy availability if we're not fueling appropriately. So you can see now for this athlete, her requirements are 3,500 calories. So we really need to think about our nutrition, just like we periodize our training, is making sure we can make these adjustments. So how do we put that together with food? So that's the most important thing. So let's just look at that recovery day or that baseline day. And you can see if we're eating 3 regular meals in the day, we're having a couple of snacks, then we can't go too wrong. And we're going to basically fuel that recovery day quite easily. The trouble that we have is when we do these triple training days. So you can see we've left in there those 3 snacks. And what we're doing now is we're thinking about fueling before training, especially in that morning, and after training. So a really important thing for athletes to think about is how we distribute our energy across the day. And one of the real risk factors that we see in a lot of athletes is poor fueling in the mornings. There's a lot of sort of fad diets around intermittent fasting that might restrict energy. And we know from research done in especially gymnastics, that when we restrict energy for long periods of time, even if we're eating enough, that can have detrimental effects on reproductive hormones. And then what we're thinking about now is having a bigger afternoon snack. We're also now thinking about additional carbohydrate during that prolonged training session. So that could be any type of endurance session. And now we also think about having a recovery snack afterwards. So you can see the general adolescent athlete is not going to be doing this amount of training. I mean, adolescent that's not training. But when we train at this level, we really need to think about, we need that additional fuel for the body to get the energy that it requires. So again, really important, spreading out the nutrition across the day, being well planned, and having a good mindset around pre-training, during training, and in recovery.
It's interesting and a great reminder that even on a Netflix and chill day, we still do need to be eating good food and often to just generally survive, but also to recover from those bigger training days. Sarah, Jane's given us an insight into what we need to be eating to have enough energy, but what happens if we already are, or we realise that we are under fueling? What will our recovery plan look like?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I think if we use an example of, I guess what I'm seeing in my clinic is someone who may have lost their period for 7 months. And the first thing I need to try and work out to manage and help this athlete recover is, are they deliberately under fueling? Are they trying to, is there an excessive desire for thinness? Are they trying to be as light as possible because they believe that will make them faster and have developed a lot of disordered eating practices? Or are they just not meaning to, but they just are not eating enough for what they're doing? And so often they're the one that isn't eating enough for what they're doing and not really meaning to be thin. It's a really easy kind of management plan. They just need some education on timing and everything that Dane's just outlined. And for those ones, their recovery of their energy status can happen really quickly. So we can see that their energy can be in surplus within a few days or a week. And usually if they continue to have a positive energy balance, their periods can come back in a couple of months. If they've been struggling for a long period of time and have really been severely under fueling, then we know that the menstrual status can take quite a bit longer to improve, and in some cases can be even up to a couple of years. What is quite challenging is bone mineral density, and athletes or all adolescents build their best bone up to about the age of 20 to 21. And so this is their time to build good bone, yet it's often the time that their energy is compromised. And so for those athletes who have already had an issue with underfueling for so long, their bone density can be poor. This can take years to improve, and some actually, if we don't get onto it early enough, they don't. One of the difficulties that we have is the recovery of, so we've got the energy status, the menstrual status, the bone density. For me, the thing that I think takes the longest recovery for some people is the psychological aspect of this. So for some people, they've got a full-blown eating disorder. For some people, it's just a constant calculation of energy in, energy out. Am I thin? Do I look good in my training uniform? And that stuff is very challenging. So the message that I'm always trying to say to these people is, look, we need to make a science of this, remove the emotion that could be so kind of associated with the female psyche sometimes, and female in sport. And athletes, they eat and train, they don't diet and exercise, or sometimes eat like an athlete, not like a chick. And it's just a message that we constantly have to be getting out there to help support each other.
Thanks, Sarah and Dane, for your time and for giving us an understanding of fueling and how we can recover from underfueling. That wraps up this webinar, but if you would like some additional information on the topic, there is plenty of information if you head to the HPSNZ website and search for WHISPA, WHISPA. If anything you've heard here makes you concerned about your own health, please contact your healthcare provider. You and your health are too important not to.